Hello and welcome to Watch This Space. I'm Brian Carney, and my guest on this episode is Michael Abad-Santos. Michael is the CEO of Rivada Select Services, and he's one of the point people for our work with the U.S. Navy. So, Michael, welcome to the show.
Hi, Brian. How you doing? Thanks for having me.
Doing great, and really appreciate you coming on and talking to us for a bit about Rivada's work with the Navy and what the Outernet means for um, that customer in particular and our government customers and prospective government customers in general. We get a lot of questions about the nature of that work, and I figured you were the best person to answer some of those questions. So I really appreciate your time. I know you're super busy.
Oh, no, thank you. And I have to say it's good to be on the show and talk about this. And something that you probably don't know. I
Yeah.
don't think we've spoken about this before. Is I've been working on the outer net since 2014, right? So happy to see the progress that we're making here at Rivada with actually bringing this space architecture to fruition, because it's something that I've been trying so hard to to launch, and it's extremely different, and it's something that's never been done before, so that makes it hard, and
Right.
um,
Yeah,
just really
since you brought that
really
up,
excited
let me
about that.
just let's take a detour then maybe and talk a bit about what's different. Because this is a question that I also get a lot, and I'm sure you get it a lot too, is people say, what are you guys doing that's different from every other Leo constellation? And you said this is an idea that in a sense you've been pursuing for a decade. So, you know, in your words, or, describe it in your own terms. What is that idea and how is it different and why is it important
Yeah.
that you've been chasing it for a decade?
So I'm an old satellite guy, right? I've been doing this for almost 30 years now, and you know, I've always been interested in the LEO satellites and what they can do, and how they're different from what traditional geo satellites can do. Um, and when, the first Leo constellation was put up, Starlink, and then you have OneWeb. Essentially, what they did is they took a traditional geostationary architecture or geosynchronous architecture for the satellite constellation and just moved the altitude down. So it's still
Okay.
really just a bend pipe solution, and doesn't take advantage of the natural capabilities that we do once we get to Earth, which is how all the routing, where all the magic happens in terms of routing traffic and getting data
Right.
from A to B, right? And to me, it has always been just extremely kind of just the word. What's the word I'm looking for? It just obvious, extremely obvious that if we're pushing data into space, why don't we route the data in space to get it to where it needs to go more efficiently, faster, and more securely? And that's exactly what we're doing with the outer net, right? Where we've taken the traditional terrestrial communications infrastructure that we know well, from an enterprise perspective and from a government perspective, and we're just moving those capabilities up into space. We're putting routers in space, and we're routing traffic in space, and we are minimizing all of the potential threats from that you have with terrestrial infrastructure, and we're putting it in a very hard to reach place, and that creates a even more secure network, right? So
Right.
we're doing things more efficiently from a networking perspective. We're doing things more securely, and the cool thing is we're not taking anything new. We're just taking a whole bunch of proven terrestrial technologies, and putting them up in space, right?
Right.
And In a sense, Clemens, our CEO at Rivada Space, talks about this a lot. He's like, we're not really a space company, we're kind of a software company. And in a sense, that's absolutely correct. But also, this is a completely new architecture. And it's an extremely obvious architecture. And I think that's evidenced by how much commercial traction we've gotten, and a lot of traction from the government. But it's
Right.
just never, to me, it's amazing to me that it's never been done before. So
So,
I'm
okay. So
extremely glad that we're doing this.
yeah, let me just, I try to make sure we don't take too much for granted here with our viewers. So I'm gonna just back you up and hopefully you can help walk me through this. But so geo is geosynchronous or geostationary orbit. So these are kind of in the early days,
Satellites.
right?
Yeah.
Satellites that didn't move with respect to some position on the surface of the Earth, and they usually are sitting around the equator, which is why the E
Yeah,
is equatorial, right? And that's a long to get satellites that move at the same rate that the Earth is rotating. You have to put them a really long way out there, but then they can also cover, a huge whatever, a third of the surface of the Earth or something
exactly.
from that.
Yep.
So it's simple to point a dish at it because it doesn't move, right? It's
Mhm.
got huge coverage for a single bird. They tend to be really big. I've heard people say they're bus sized, right?
I've
And
worked on satellites that were the size of London double-decker buses.
right. And but they're a long way away, and the bandwidth tends to be small, and the latency is high because the signals have a long round trip and so on. And they also, they don't cover the far side of the earth, and they have trouble with higher latitudes, right? So there are limitations, but there are clearly benefits, and especially before phased array antennas, having knowing exactly where to point your dish and having that dish be in the same place relative to the earth for kind of everybody were
Yeah.
huge advantages in the early days, right? So I'm putting words in your mouth, but I think that's all fair to say. um, Leo satellites orbit much closer to the surface of the Earth, but they're not stationary with respect to the surface of the Earth. So they're winging around, right? So you can't just point a parabolic dish at one location and hit the same
Yeah.
satellite. The, Either the dishes have to move, or more practically, and the kind of the modern standard is you're using a phased array dish that's using electronics to aim the beams and is capable of handing off between satellites as they fly past. So those are the LEO constellations, the
Yeah.
the the Starlinks and the OneWebs and the Outernets, and they require there's a different set of trade-offs there, right? You don't just get to point a stationary parabolic dish in one location, but you get lower latency, you get potentially higher bandwidth, you can choose your coverage in effect, right? Because the Outernet has polar orbits. Some of the other ones have these donut orbits that prioritize the kind of the mid latitudes, but give up coverage in the higher latitudes where maybe there's fewer people anyway. So they say, well, we want to focus on where the people are versus, the outer net is making a different set of trade-offs in part because, as you said, we're routing traffic through space, and having those polar orbits in some cases allows for better routes than if you have this kind of donut shaped Leo
Yeah. Definitely.
constellation. Um, so I just wanted to kind of give the audience some background on Geo versus Leo so that we don't lose people right away. But so what you're saying is that when we started to move to Leo, the kind of the model that we had was Geo, and the early Leo constellations borrowed certain kinds of operational principles and system architectures from what we were already doing in satellite without regard to whether that was really the best way to implement a constellation in low Earth orbit. And the outer net, obviously, we at Rivada did not invent this idea. But as you said, it's an idea that has not really been realized yet, despite its sort of obviousness. Maybe because people just didn't start with a clean sheet of paper, right? Like one of the things I know Teslas are now controversial in the world, but I think one of the things that Tesla did really well was they said, okay, we're not going to build a car with all these assumptions about how to build a car and how the
Yeah,
electronic architecture even that the legacy car makers are. We're going to start with a clean sheet of paper and we're going to say, okay, if we're doing this from scratch, which we are, how would we do it? Not how do the big three do it, or even how does Mercedes or BMW do it? But how would you do it now, given the networking and the computing technology and so on that we have? And the Outernet idea is and stop me
it's
if I say anything stupid or wrong, right? But it's
yeah,
sort of starting with a clean sheet of paper and saying, okay, if I was going to build a constellation for modern networking, this is how I would do it.
exactly. And in my mind, it's an optimization question, right? So, 30 years ago, when we didn't have fast tracking parabolic dishes and electronically steered array antennas. Yeah, we just didn't have the technology back then to be able to do what we did now. And back then we optimized for one where people were. So, right, between 65 degrees north and south was where the majority of humans were. We optimized for the type of data that wanted to be distributed, which was primarily radio and television. So, media type broadcast data.
Right.
Um, and so that's how the satellite community and industry was originally optimized. It was optimized to do these things that geosynchronous satellites or geostationary are perfectly designed to do. They're optimized to deliver data to a wide amount of people as you can, in as an efficient way as possible. And it still blows my mind that this whole concept of geostationary satellites was created by a guy by the name of Arthur C. Clarke, who wrote science fiction. Right? I mean, it's still amazing to me that's how that concept came about.
That's
Um,
wild.
but now the world has changed, right? Who would have thought back in the 90s that we would be carrying supercomputers in our pockets?
Right.
And as a result of having a supercomputer in your pocket, it's what's the natural thing to do is just like consume a lot of data with it, right? Now the type of data that we're consuming changes over time, as we see, but at the end of the day, it's still all ones and zeros. And when I first got, when I first started working in communications, right, I was working on terrestrially 2.4 kilobit per second networks, X.25 networks.
Right.
And when I got out, we had finally, when I'd switched into space, the terrestrial side was kind of at that OC3/OCX, 155 megabits per second. And now, we're talking terabits a second terrestrially.
Right.
When I got into space, ironically enough, the very first system I worked on did 2.4 kilobits per second in dial-up, right?
Right.
And now here I am at Rivada, and we're talking about 20 gigabits per second. And we
Yeah.
have components on our satellites that are capable of doing hundreds of gigabits per second. And eventually, we'll see a terabit per second in space, which is kind of amazing to me. But yeah, at the end of the day, it really is becoming an optimization. What Rivada is doing is really optimized to satisfy high-end enterprise and government uses based upon the technology that's available today, readily available today, and based on these new use cases, which didn't exist 20, 30 years ago. So it's really exciting. But it also it's amazing to me that it's very obvious, but no one's done it yet. So that's why I'm here, right?
Right.
I think of Rivada as optimizing for communications the way it happens now in this century and in this decade, and I think we're well positioned to be kind of ahead of the curve in terms of being not future proof, because nothing's ever future proof, but
Sure.
definitely able to work in this future space architecture.
Right. Well, I mean, as you said, the sort of capabilities inform use cases, which, sometimes give rise to advance. When these things came out, right, I was an early adopter. I paid AT&T $650 for one of the first iPhones, and there were no networks for it, right? It didn't
Yeah,
support, I don't even think it supported 3G, right? I would take a
yeah.
30-minute train to work the whenever that was, 2007. If I was, and the train went into a tunnel 20 minutes into my ride. If I was lucky, I could download a single web page between the time I got on the train and the time I lost service going into that tunnel on that first iPhone. But, you know, as the networks evolved, the use cases evolved, and that gave rise to need for different system architectures and different capabilities on the devices. And, that they all feed into each other. And so, yeah, I think your observation about, optimization and thinking about what the use cases are, um, is super important, because you build a network kind of for a purpose, and partly that purpose is, how do people use networks, and what do they use them for? One of the things that's happened in recent decades is, I'm probably not supposed to use the W word, right? But war fighting has become much more connected, right? Our
Absolutely.
whole military apparatus relies on data to an extent that certainly, our grandfathers couldn't have imagined with their crank radios and so on. And so the need to get back to the where I where we started with the Navy, right? The need for connectivity, and the not just the purposes to which they put it, but the kind of bandwidth that they need, the kind of coverage that they need, right? All of that changes as the way that they use communications changes. And so having a system architecture designed to serve, those the use cases of today, and as I said earlier, right, kind of started with a clean sheet of paper, not based on, you know, preconceptions that were informed by technological constraints that, maybe no longer apply because of advanced antennas, because of high capacity laser links, because of, you know, better low angle service and better error correction that allows for better throughput in certain bands or whatever. I'm not, people who watch this know that I'm not an engineer, but I talk to them, and sometimes I pick up a word or two. So I half know what I'm talking about. But yeah, I mean, can you say something about our work with the Navy, and either, I don't know, you tell me what they're saying to us about why this is important to them, or what you're learning about how they, the networks that they need, and the importance to them.
Yeah.
We had Commander Goddard, now retired, on the show last year, and he said, one of the great things about working with Rivada is, because we haven't launched yet, they are able to inform our requirements and our, make sure that our systems do what they need them to do, so that when they are up in space, you know, they are certain that
Yeah.
they can use them.
No, it's the observation about how we prosecute warfare in this century. I would go so far as to say that without communications, we would be it, it's a losing proposition, right? So it's no surprise that the very first capability that our adversaries want to take out is our ability to communicate. Our entire the way we prosecute the war, talk about joint all domain command and control. And if we go back to concepts from even 20 to 30 years ago when we said every soldier is a sensor and every sensor needs to communicate. Communications is the backbone of everything that we do from a U.S. military perspective. The what Commander Goddard said is very true, right? There is, in the time that I've been in this industry, there have been very few instances in which the U.S. government has spent so much time prior to launch with a commercial provider, right? They do this on their own military SATCOM systems.
Sure.
But spending the time to talk to us about the threats that are out there, and the capabilities that they would like us to have, we call them desirements because we're not going to be able to do everything. Because at the end of the day, we are still a commercial company and we have to make commercial decisions.
Right.
But spending a lot of time with the government and the Navy in particular, talking about building defense in to our network, to make it a more useful tool for governments and enterprises. It's not just governments who are worried about threats to their network. It's all, we're seeing in the past, we've always seen government moving more towards commercial solutions and commercial ways of operating because commercial was agile and it got to market faster. It was more efficient. But what I've been seeing in the last 5 to 10 years is enterprises kind of moving their stance more towards the government security stance,
Right.
because there is such a threat. Well, one, because we are also reliant upon these networks to just do our daily business, and the threat landscape keeps continuing to grow. So we're seeing a convergence between government and enterprise on just having defensive capabilities within the system. So some of the work that we are doing with the U.S. Navy is really focused on just building a really secure network, right? So the
Right.
Navy is spending a lot of time talking to us about how it implements, excuse me, zero trust and what that
Yeah.
means, right? And
Right.
zero trust, there's nine pillars and 170 or 190, and the number grows every day in terms of controls, et cetera. But really, what we're doing at Rivada is kind of embracing the philosophy of zero trust and what that means, and how do we implement it in an efficient commercial way, with some guidance from the customers and the government. So we're seeing a lot of changes, just in terms of how we operate as an enterprise, in terms of
Right.
some of the security controls, and the way Rivada manages just the way it connects to the internet and distributes laptops and all that. All of that is part of zero trust, and we are
Right.
taking that philosophy and we are applying that as well to our satellite network and the Outernet.
Yes, and we
So,
we we had Kelly Hayes on the show on an earlier
oh, she's
episode to
great,
talk
isn't she?
about.
Yeah.
She's amazing, and she's got some great stories. Some of which I wish she would tell on the show, but she's too discreet for that. But she and I talked a lot about building a secure organization because if you're trying to build the most or one of the most secure satellite constellations in the world, but you don't kind of protect your rear flank, as it were, then
Yeah.
you're exposing yourself. And I'm sure that's a place where the Navy has had input and is helping to inform some of that stuff you're
Commander
talking
Goddard,
about.
yeah. Commander Goddard always said the biggest weakness to any network is the squishy human in the middle, right? And
Right.
so a lot of the things that we're doing at Rivada is part of Kelly's work in term, she's in our security office, is training, just regular security training and regular security awareness. We are we are subject to so many phishing attacks, and because so many people want to get into our network.
Right.
And the phishing attacks get more and more sophisticated and realistic every year. right? Back in the day, you could tell because they were spelled so horribly, they didn't make sense, and they wouldn't hide their URLs. Now all of that stuff has changed. So a large part of the zero trust work that we are doing and we're taking to heart is this consistent security training, threat awareness. In my organization, Rivada Select, we are,
Yeah.
we're starting from scratch, so that's a good thing. We don't have a lot of stuff that we need to change, but we are implementing what is called CMMC2, which is a very strict use case on how we operate our internet, our
Okay.
enterprise functionality, right? So our Outlook, et cetera. So we're getting ourselves implemented now, and our first audit's going to be in 6 months. So we're actually audit. You can't have training and a security posture without auditing as well.
Right.
So we're also doing that as part of our work with the U.S. government. So we're
So
taking
is that an
security very
audit? Is that an
seriously.
audit by the government then, or is it an
Yeah,
audit by
yeah,
the,
yeah.
yeah,
No, well, it's a third party on behalf of the government, but
on
yeah,
behalf
I
of the
mean,
government? Okay.
so yeah, we're I think one of the things that really separates Rivada as a whole organization enterprise, and specifically as Rivada Select is the seriousness in which we treat enterprise security and zero trust and how that ethos translates into everything we're trying to do as an organization. And ultimately, at the end of the day, what I am worried about and what I think about on a daily basis is how can I best support the warfighter? So how can I best support the Navy, the Army, the Air Force, Space Force, Coast Guard, Marine Corps? How can what we do here help them, do their jobs more
Do their
effectively and more
jobs. Yeah.
securely and more safely?
Yeah. Well, believe it or not, we've gone for almost 30 minutes here already. So I don't want to keep you, Mike, but I really appreciate your time. If there's anything else you you want to say, feel free to
No,
jump in, or
no.
if there's something else you want to talk about. Otherwise, I think we'll call it there. And I appreciate the conversation and really appreciate the work you're doing on behalf of obviously the company, but hopefully for the benefit of the country as well. So thanks.
I appreciate that. Thanks, Brian.
Thanks.